For centuries, the Galactic Empire had been an unchallenged force, its grip tightening across the stars like a vice. Worlds had fallen one by one, their people crushed beneath the cold, mechanized might of the Empire's war machine. It was a process that had become routine. The same pattern repeated itself: discovery, annexation, and subjugation. The Empire's vast fleets would descend upon unprepared planets, their forces overwhelming all resistance. In its wake, entire civilizations were either absorbed into the Empire's vast bureaucracy or erased entirely. To the Empire, it was just another day of expansion. The first time I saw Earth on the radar, I didn't know what to make of it. It was an anomaly, a tiny blip in a remote part of the galaxy. The coordinates didn't match anything of significance. We'd long since scoured every known system for possible threats, and Earth had been written off. It had been lost, possibly wiped out in some long-forgotten conflict, or left to rot in isolation. I'd seen the reports Earth had once been home to a species known as humanity, but they were irrelevant now. Their technology was primitive, their spacefaring capabilities non-existent. There was nothing that had ever warranted further attention. But when the signal came, everything changed. It wasn't a distress signal or a message of surrender. It wasn't even a beacon of some lost civilization hoping for rescue. It was a strange burst of energy out of place, a fragmentary echo hidden within the noise of deep space communications. It wasn't until one of the Empire's most skilled technicians, on a routine sweep of long-range frequencies, discovered it that we even realized it had been sent from Earth. At first, we thought it was a fluke, a malfunction of some kind, an accidental transmission. But when the anomaly persisted, the higher-ups took notice. I was serving on the Vindicator at the time, a mid-ranking officer in the Imperial Navy. The Vindicator wasn't the most prestigious vessel in the fleet, but it was equipped with enough firepower to level entire cities. My station was barely more than a cog in the vast machine of the Empire, but when the order came, I was one of the officers tasked with the mission. A direct communication from the Imperial High Command. We were to investigate the source of the signal. A full-scale fleet was mobilized, and soon after we were en route to Earth. The Empire, as usual, expected nothing more than a quick, decisive operation. After all, we had crushed more formidable civilizations. What could Earth's human remnants possibly pose to the might of the Galactic Empire? We were a vast empire, a monolith that had swallowed dozens of star systems. The humans had no fleet, no technology that even remotely compared to the Empire's. The Vindicator was equipped with the latest weapons, shield generators, and hyperspace drives that made it nigh unstoppable. Earth, it seemed, was a forgotten relic, a quaint curiosity in the corner of the galaxy. But as the fleet approached, the first signs of resistance began to show. The sensors picked up unusual readings, a subtle but distinct energy signature that seemed to come from Earth's atmosphere. We couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't anything we'd ever encountered before. Still, the Imperial fleet continued its course with the same certainty that had characterized all previous conquests. Nothing could prepare us for what was to come. The humans, from what little we knew, were just another inconsequential species. But in the silence of space, that distant signal felt like the first tremor of something we were ill-prepared to face. When the Imperial fleet arrived in Earth's orbit, we had no reason to believe the operation would be anything less than routine. The humans, as far as we were concerned, were little more than a curiosity. We had deployed our strongest warships, the best commanders, and the finest crews from the Imperial Navy. The flagship, Vindicator, was led by Fleet Admiral Vieras, a battle-hardened officer with decades of experience. She was a woman who exuded confidence, someone who had seen the rise and fall of countless worlds under the Empire's banner. For all our expectations of an easy conquest, there was an undercurrent of something else, in awareness that, perhaps, we had underestimated Earth. As we moved into orbit, the first indications that Earth was not as defenseless as we'd assumed came in the form of faint, scattered transmissions. At first, we dismissed them as insignificant, a series of static-filled messages that could have been anything from human distress signals to remnants of some old communication network they'd failed to shut down. But there was something strange about the transmissions. They weren't just random noise, they were deliberate. as though someone, somewhere on Earth, was purposefully reaching out. Fleet Admiral Varys had ordered a full survey of Earth's atmosphere, and what we found only deepened our confusion. Earth had no significant spacefaring infrastructure. There were no fleets to challenge us, no advanced weapon systems like those found in other worlds we had conquered. And yet, there was a defensive presence. The humans had some kind of primitive but surprisingly resilient weaponry orbiting their planet scrap-built satellites with crude laser arrays, crude defensive systems that shouldn't have been capable of targeting a fleet of our size. These weren't military-grade weapons by any means, but they were still effective in the hands of an intelligent species. The initial strike from Earth's defenders came without warning. A series of rockets launched from the surface, their trajectories erratic and unpredictable. They had clearly been assembled hastily, with little understanding of proper targeting mechanics, yet they were aimed directly at our ships. The missiles were slow, and we easily evaded most of them, but the first salvo was a warning, a message from the humans. They were not afraid. I stood on the bridge, watching as our scanners detected the faint traces of human craft emerging from Earth's atmosphere. Their ships were nothing like the sleek Imperial warships, not even close. They were cobbled-together vessels, makeshift designs, built from parts scavenged from old technologies. They had no shields, no advanced weaponry, and their engines were inefficient, leaving a trail of ionized gas behind them as they sped towards us. But there was one thing that immediately struck me: the humans weren't running. They were coming straight at us. The first wave was small dozens of human craft, no larger than fighter jets, each one brimming with raw, desperate energy. They did not attempt to match us in firepower, nor did they retreat in the face of our overwhelming presence. Instead, they engaged us in a chaotic dance, firing their primitive weapons in bursts and weaving erratically to avoid our targeting systems. It was all so human. No strategy, no coordination, but a fight fueled by sheer will and desperation. I remember watching one of their ships, a battered-looking vessel, launch a reckless, high-speed maneuver toward the Vindicator. Its pilot was clearly a seasoned veteran of this kind of engagement. He was trying to throw off our fire, attempting to make a direct assault on one of our weaker points. The ship's systems malfunctioned, and it veered off course, crashing into one of our support ships, but the pilot's determination had been undeniable. They weren't just fighting to defend themselves, they were fighting for something more. Our fleet's response was swift and brutal. Within minutes, our firepower had overwhelmed their tiny fleet, and the skies around Earth were filled with the remnants of shattered human ships. But despite the victory, something lingered in the air, something unsettling. It wasn't just the fight, it was the humans themselves. Their resolve had been undeniable. We had expected to crush them easily, to make an example of Earth and its insignificant people. Instead, we were met with a resistance we hadn't prepared for. Their actions were uncoordinated, yes, but they were no less dangerous for it. The sheer unpredictability of their attacks, the reckless bravery of their pilots, the defiance they showed in the face of annihilation, all of it left a mark on us. As our ships moved to secure the atmosphere and begin the descent toward the surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary conquest. The humans had shown us something. They had shown us that, while we could destroy their ships, we couldn't crush their spirit. It was a realization that would haunt me in the days to come, because if the humans fought this fiercely with what little they had, we had underestimated them in ways that would prove costly. As the days passed, it became increasingly clear that the humans weren't going to simply surrender. We had expected them to break under the weight of our forces, to bow to the inevitable crushing might of the Galactic Empire. But instead, they dug in, and we found ourselves engaged in a battle unlike any we had ever fought. The human resistance wasn't a well-organized army with professional soldiers, it wasn't a carefully planned strategy. It was chaos, yes, but it was a chaos that worked. There was no order, no pattern to their movements, but there was determination, a kind of raw, unrefined will that refused to be extinguished. They weren't fighting for glory, or for land, or for power. They were fighting for survival, for their home, and that made them unpredictable. By the end of the second week, the Empire's expectations had shifted. Earth was not as easily subdued as we had thought. What had initially been a skirmish, a brief brush with a seemingly insignificant species, had turned into something far more complicated. The humans were not just resisting, they were adapting. Every attack we launched was met with a counterattack. Every strategy we devised was thwarted by their uncanny ability to improvise. They didn't have the technology to stand toe-to-toe with the Empire's finest weapons, but they didn't need to. They fought with a cunning and resourcefulness that kept us on our toes. The first real surprise came when we tried to establish a foothold on the surface. We had deployed a significant number of ground troops, confident that once we controlled Earth's skies, the surface would fall easily. But that wasn't the case. As we descended to Earth, our dropships were met with a barrage of fire. At first, we thought it was random, perhaps a few rogue elements with scavenged weapons. But as the firefight intensified, it became clear that there was something more organized at play. Humans, it seemed, had established a vast network of underground bunkers, bases, and fortifications beneath the surface of their planet. These were not the scattered remnants of a primitive species, they were coordinated, strategic, and lethal. On the ground, it was a different kind of war. The humans fought with a kind of ferocity that we had not encountered before. Their soldiers were not well trained in the traditional sense, but they were highly resourceful. I saw one human soldier use an old, outdated anti-tank missile to bring down one of our At-8 walkers, a machine that was supposed to be impervious to any conventional weapon. The human soldier had no training, no formal military structure behind him. But he knew his terrain, he knew his weapons, and he knew how to exploit our weaknesses. His precision was unsettling. It wasn't just the soldiers on the ground. The humans had mobilized their entire planet, coordinating resistance efforts across cities, rural areas, and even in the wilderness. They were fighting not as separate factions, but as a unified front. From the poorest slums to the most technologically advanced cities, every human was part of the struggle. This unity, this collective resolve, was something we had not anticipated. We had always assumed that when we crushed their forces, their morale would crumble, but it did the opposite. The more we pushed them, the more they pushed back, and the more they seemed to rally around the idea that they would never bow to an invader. Our tactics became more aggressive. We began bombing cities, attempting to break the human spirit by destroying their homes and families. We targeted their infrastructure, their power grids, their communication networks, hoping to starve the resistance of the resources it needed to continue. But even then, the humans adapted. They rebuilt, they repaired. They found ways to communicate, ways to strike back even when everything seemed lost. It wasn't just the physical fight that was wearing us down, it was the psychological warfare, the sheer will of the human spirit that refused to be broken. I remember one night, during an attack on a major city, watching as a human civilian, a woman who appeared to be no more than a simple farmer, threw herself in front of an Imperial soldier, throwing her body on top of him to protect him from an incoming blast. It was a bizarre moment. This woman, clearly unarmed and out of her depth, had placed herself between the soldier and the destruction. But it wasn't just an act of desperation, it was an act of defiance. A belief that no one, not even the most powerful military force in the galaxy, could dictate their fate. We were facing something far greater than an enemy. We were facing an entire species that was willing to fight until the last breath, not for power, but for the very essence of their identity. And with each passing day, I began to wonder if we had made a grave mistake. Could we defeat them? Yes, but would we ever break their spirit? I began to doubt. The more I saw the human resistance fighting in ways that defied all logic, all expectation, the more I understood that this war, for all its battles and victories, was not one we could win easily. And that realization, that humanity's greatest strength was not in their technology or their armies, but in their resolve, made me fear them in ways I hadn't thought possible. By the fourth week of the conflict, the situation had become even more complex. The initial reports had suggested that the human resistance would falter once we established our superiority in space, but those predictions had proven woefully inaccurate. The war, which had once seemed like a foregone conclusion, had transformed into something more ambiguous. The Empire's military might was unrivaled, but the humans' resolve seemed endless. and they were beginning to fight with a terrifying kind of ingenuity that we hadn't fully anticipated. The human forces, though outgunned and outnumbered, had taken to guerrilla tactics with an effectiveness that made our superior technology almost irrelevant in some cases. They didn't engage us in large, coordinated battles. Instead, they would strike quickly, disappear into the shadows, and reappear elsewhere. Their knowledge of Earth's terrain, its forests, mountains, urban landscapes was their greatest asset. Every time we thought we had them cornered, they would melt away, only to strike again when we least expected it. The humans had adapted to the war with a kind of fluidity, as if the very nature of their survival was woven into the conflict. I had been on the surface with a squadron when we first encountered their most effective tactic. We had set up a forward base in a dense urban center, hoping to root out any remnants of the resistance. It was supposed to be a straightforward mission: clear out a few pockets of enemy forces, establish control, and move on. But the city proved to be a labyrinth. The humans had fortified it in ways we hadn't imagined. Entire buildings had been hollowed out, turned into underground bunkers, and I began to realize just how little we knew about their methods of defense. The first attack came at dawn, an explosion tearing through one of our supply lines. At first, we thought it was a rogue missile or a stray blast, but when the second and third explosions hit in quick succession, we knew it was a coordinated assault. We scrambled to secure the area, but the humans were already moving. Their troops, scattered across the city, had set traps everywhere. We found our own soldiers caught in ambushes, walking into what appeared to be empty alleys, only to be caught by hidden snipers or a sudden volley of explosives. Their ambushes were relentless, and no matter how many times we set up secure perimeters, they found a way to penetrate them. Then came the tunnels. It was a system beneath the city, vast and intricate. At first, we thought it was just a few old subterranean passageways, relics of a time before the war. But it turned out the humans had turned the entire underground network into their base of operations. We discovered hidden entrances in the basements of buildings, under old subway systems, in abandoned factories. They could move in and out of the city without us even knowing they were there, striking and disappearing like ghosts. Each attack seemed to come from a different direction, and each time we thought we had gained ground, we were blindsided by their ability to remain unseen. The more I saw of their tactics, the more I began to respect the humans. It was one thing to fight back with technology, but it was something entirely different to fight back using the environment itself. It wasn't just about superior weaponry. It was about their tenacity, their resourcefulness. They didn't just adapt to the war, they redefined it. We had relied on overwhelming force and firepower, and while that worked in open battles, it was useless in the face of the humans' adaptability. The loss of several Imperial officers, including one of my own commanding officers, shook the morale of our troops. It wasn't just the casualties that were troubling, though. It was the fact that every time we thought we had broken their resistance, they seemed to rise again, more determined than ever. We began to hear rumors among the ranks, whispers that the humans were organizing larger and larger coalitions of resistance across the globe, even pooling resources from multiple countries to coordinate their attacks. What had begun as a ragtag resistance movement had become something far more sophisticated, and the Empire's underestimation of their capabilities was beginning to show. The human leadership, too, had proven elusive. We had expected their leaders to fall quickly, to cower in the face of Imperial power. Instead, we found that the humans' leadership was decentralized, and every local cell had its own command structure, which made it impossible to disrupt their chain of command. The humans didn't fight like a single entity, they fought like millions of individual voices, each contributing to the larger cause. They had learned how to keep their lines of communication hidden from us, using encrypted networks that we had difficulty deciphering. Their decentralized nature made it impossible to pin down their leadership, and that made them all the more dangerous. At that point, I began to see the war in a different light. The humans had something we had not counted on: an unyielding sense of unity and purpose. The more we pushed them, the more they seemed to rally, feeding off their shared belief that Earth was worth fighting for. The Empire could destroy their cities, their homes, their families, but they could never destroy the heart of the human spirit. It was something we hadn't understood before the war. And now, in the heat of battle, I realized it was the one thing we couldn't defeat. The weeks dragged on, and as we pressed further into Earth's territory, the situation became increasingly untenable. The humans, though battered and broken, refused to relent. They had no centralized command, no uniform military organization, but they had something far more dangerous: a collective, unstoppable will to survive. Each city we captured, every base we demolished, was quickly replaced by new ones. It was as though their entire planet had been transformed into a battleground, with the human race fighting not just for victory, but for their very existence. Our empire, with all its military might, was losing the one thing that had always given it dominance: the certainty of victory. By now, I had seen enough of Earth's surface to understand that the humans had become a force we could not defeat in the conventional sense. They had dug in deeper, not just underground, but into their own culture, into their own identities. Their cities had turned into fortresses, their homes transformed into makeshift battlegrounds. Every time we thought we had broken their resolve, they found new ways to resist. They adapted faster than we could react. Our superior technology had no answer for their ingenuity, and it was their ingenuity that kept us on the defensive. In the weeks following our initial landing, Earth's major urban centers had been reduced to rubble. Still, the human resistance never stopped. It seemed that no matter how many lives we took, no matter how much we destroyed, there was always another group of humans rising up from the ashes. They were not a homogeneous enemy, and that was what made them so unpredictable. They fought differently in every region, using different strategies, different tactics. Some relied on technology, repurposing old systems and weaponry for their own use. Others fought using sheer numbers, overwhelming us with human bodies in wave after wave of brutal, close-quarters combat. One night, I stood in the command center of Vindicator and watched as a human ship, one of their homemade vessels, maneuvered its way toward our fleet. It was a desperate, reckless attack. The ship had no chance against our firepower, but what struck me was its pilot. I could see through the external cameras that the pilot, a man by his uniform, was gritting his teeth, eyes fixed forward, as if he were staring at something far greater than the vessel he was piloting. He knew it was a suicide mission, but he did it anyway. He had no illusions about winning. His only goal was to do whatever damage he could before he died. I watched as the human ship slammed into one of our destroyers, the impact sending shockwaves through the Vindicator. The explosion was enough to tear apart the enemy vessel, but it was also enough to severely damage one of our own ships. The crew was shaken, and for a moment, I could almost hear the silence in the bridge as we all took in the sheer madness of the act. The pilot had known he would die. He had known his chances were slim. But he had chosen to fight, to make us pay for every inch of ground we claimed. It was then that I realized the true nature of the human resistance. It wasn't about weapons or strategy. It was about sacrifice. The humans didn't just fight for their survival, they fought with the understanding that survival wasn't guaranteed. The mere act of defiance was victory enough for them, and every time we thought we had them beaten, they rose up again, willing to die for the planet they called home. The human spirit was unlike anything I had ever encountered in all my years of service. There was no fear in their eyes, only resolve. It was this resolve that kept our forces from achieving victory. We had underestimated them in ways that now seemed laughable. The strategy of the Empire overwhelming force, a swift and decisive campaign, had failed against an enemy that didn't care for force or swift victories. We were not fighting to conquer a planet. We were fighting a war of attrition, a war of ideals, and the humans had proven that they could endure longer than we had ever imagined. And as the weeks wore on, I began to understand something that had eluded me earlier. The Empire, for all its strength, had always fought for conquest, for control, for dominance. But the humans, in their defiance, were fighting for something greater: their right to exist, their right to determine their own fate. They weren't just defending a planet, they were defending their identity as a species, a force of nature. It was something that the Empire had never truly encountered before. And as I watched their resilience in the face of annihilation, I knew that this war was not one we could win by force alone. The humans had already won something far more important than any battle they had won: their will to fight. By the time the 6th week had arrived, the Empire was no longer operating with the certainty we once had. The humans were not retreating, nor were they surrendering. They were adapting faster than our strategies could evolve. Each attack, each counteroffensive only reinforced their resolve. We had underestimated the power of their unity, and now it was becoming clear that even the might of the Galactic Empire could be worn down by a species with an unrelenting will to survive. Our commanders began to shift their strategies, realizing that Earth was not going to fall in the manner we had expected. The battle lines were no longer static, they were fluid, constantly moving, always shifting. The humans, though outmatched in terms of technology and resources, were winning the psychological war. Our forces were becoming increasingly demoralized. The initial shock of their resistance had worn off, replaced by an unsettling awareness that this war would not end swiftly or cleanly. The Empire's reputation, built on swift victories and ruthless efficiency, was beginning to crack under the pressure of prolonged conflict. The true scale of the human resilience became apparent when we launched a major ground assault on a heavily fortified city. The area had been secured by our forces earlier, but as soon as we moved in to claim the area, we found that the humans had already reorganized, creating a new network of resistance within the city's ruins. This was not simply a band of survivors trying to fend for themselves, it was an organized insurgency, one that had learned how to survive under the most difficult conditions. They knew their cities, their landscapes, and how to move through them without being detected. It became impossible to differentiate between civilians and soldiers. One moment, we were surveying a street, and the next, we were under fire from hidden snipers perched atop dilapidated buildings. And it wasn't just the military forces. The human civilians were just as fierce, just as committed. I witnessed a group of ordinary civilians' families, farmers, workers taking up arms to defend their city from an empire that seemed determined to eradicate them. These people had no formal training, no combat experience, yet they fought with a tenacity that rivaled our best soldiers. They fought not because they had a stake in some greater political struggle, but because they had something more precious to protect: their homes, their families, their way of life. This primal instinct to protect their own created a kind of chaos we could not control, and every time we thought we had extinguished their resistance, another wave of humanity would rise up in defiance. I remember one particular skirmish in a suburb outside the capital. The humans had organized what we thought was a small diversionary attack, nothing more than a few raiders looking to slow us down. We had tracked their movements, cornered them in an abandoned warehouse, and prepared for a swift assault. But as we breached the building, we found ourselves surrounded. There were hundreds of them, emerging from every corner, from every hidden crevice, not just armed but ready to die for their cause. The weapons they used were crude, often old or modified from civilian tools, but they knew how to use them. They fought with a level of aggression and cunning that we had not expected from such a disorganized force. It was a terrifying thing to be caught in the middle of such unrelenting resistance. We were not facing soldiers trained in conventional warfare. We were facing human beings willing to sacrifice everything without a second thought to defend their planet. It wasn't about winning for them, it was about survival. The realization hit hard: this war was not just about the balance of power or the control of a planet. It was about something far more profound. The humans had something that the Empire could never take away. No matter how many worlds we conquered or battles we won, their unyielding will to protect what was theirs. Despite our technological superiority, despite the overwhelming firepower at our disposal, there were times when we could not secure victory. We could wipe out their fighters, destroy their cities, but we could not crush their spirit. There were days when we advanced, and there were days when they pushed us back. The war, once thought to be an exercise in conquest, had become a battle of attrition. It was no longer about victory in the traditional sense, it was about survival. The Empire, with all its might, was beginning to realize that the human spirit could not be subdued by force alone. And that thought, more than any weapon we had, began to unsettle us. The war was no longer just about the outcome, it was about how far we were willing to go to break a species that refused to bow. And with each passing day, the cost of that question grew heavier. I had seen planets burn, civilizations fall, and species crushed under the heel of the Empire. But here, on Earth, it was different. The humans were showing us a side of war we had never truly understood. A side that made us question everything we had ever believed about our own power. The final weeks of the conflict marked a turning point, not just for the war, but for my understanding of the human species. I had seen their resilience, their ingenuity, and their unyielding will to survive, but now I began to see something deeper, something more profound. We had underestimated the strength of humanity's spirit. They weren't just fighting for Earth, they were fighting for the idea that they mattered. For the first time, I realized that we weren't dealing with a species that could be conquered simply by overpowering them with advanced technology or firepower. They were fighting to preserve something far more intangible, their identity. It was clear that Earth was not going to fall. Not in the way we had envisioned. We had pushed, we had attacked, we had destroyed their cities, but each time the humans had rebuilt. Their resolve had not just withstood the brunt of our assault, it had grown stronger with every attack. They had become like a force of nature, unstoppable in their persistence. The more we fought them, the more they evolved, adapting their tactics, their strategies, their very will to fight. It was a cycle that wore us down. No matter how much we destroyed, it only seemed to fuel their resistance. Our supply lines, stretched thin by the extended campaign, began to fray. Our soldiers, once confident and resolute, began to show signs of wear. The Empire's great machinery of war, once seen as invincible, was showing cracks. Reports came in daily about skirmishes where our forces were outsmarted, outmaneuvered, or simply outlasted by the humans. The Empire, in all its glory, was now being forced into a corner. It was no longer a matter of whether we could conquer Earth, but whether we could survive long enough to maintain any semblance of control. But even in the face of overwhelming resistance, there were those who believed victory was still within our grasp. They insisted that Earth's eventual collapse was inevitable, that the human will to resist could only hold for so long. Their arguments sounded hollow to me now. Each day the humans proved us wrong. Each day they continued to fight back, to hold on to what was theirs, regardless of the cost. It was this refusal to submit, this utter rejection of the idea that they were conquerable, that unnerved me the most. I remember a particular encounter late in the conflict. We had cornered a large group of human fighters in a rural region, one of the last strongholds they had maintained against us. We expected them to fold, to surrender or scatter. But when we launched our assault, they did not retreat. Instead, they fought with the kind of ferocity that I had only seen in the most desperate of battles. It wasn't just a matter of survival, it was personal. Every human on that battlefield, whether soldier or civilian, fought with the understanding that this moment would define their existence, that the survival of their species was on the line. In the chaos of the battle, I saw it clearly. These humans weren't simply fighting for Earth, they were fighting for their place in the galaxy. They were fighting to be seen, to prove that they were more than just a primitive species. And with every strike they made, every plan they executed, they showed me that they were no longer the underdog we had thought them to be. They were warriors, and they were fighting not for a victory in battle, but for the survival of their way of life. As the last days of the campaign unfolded, the Empire's forces began to retreat. The sheer weight of the human resistance had taken its toll on us. We had failed to break their spirit, and in doing so, we had failed to defeat them. Earth, despite all our might, had proven to be unconquerable. The humans had fought not just for Earth, but for something more, the very essence of their existence. I had thought the Empire's vast resources, its technology, its might, would be enough to crush them. But I had been wrong. The war had taught me that the human spirit could not be measured by firepower or technology. It could only be measured by their will to fight, by their refusal to give up, no matter how dire the situation seemed. We had entered this war thinking we were the masters of the galaxy. We left with a profound understanding that the humans, with all their flaws and limitations, were something far more dangerous, a species that would not be defeated. And it was this realization that marked the true end of the conflict, not our retreat, but the knowledge that we had failed to conquer Earth, and that humanity had, in its own way, already won.